for educational purposes only. Viewer discretion. Advised America has a long history of injustice, the horrors of chattel slavery and systemic racism, leaving deep scars across generations. The dispossession, forced assimilation, and legal erasure of indigenous and Afro-Indigenous communities. Today, reparations conversations often focus mainly on descendants of slavery. But what if the labels we use, Black, African American, Negro, colored, don't reflect the full complexity of ancestry for many Americans? What if many carry overlapping lineages, African, Indigenous, or both, hidden or erased on paper? What if a new collective identity could help unify those overlapping truths and build a stronger foundation for reparations? Reparations are not a theoretical concept in America. They have been granted before. One example is the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, signed on August 10, 1988, which provided redress to survivors of the wartime internment of Japanese Americans under Japanese American internment during World War II. Under the act, surviving internees received $20,000 each and a formal apology. Over 82,000 people eventually received redress checks. This shows that when injustice is legally acknowledged and a harmed population clearly defined, reparations can happen, even decades later. If the U.S. government could accept responsibility and pay survivors for internment, why should reparations for descendants of slavery, or for descendants of erased indigenous lineages, be considered impossible? Today's reparations discussions tend to depend on proving descent from enslaved Africans through genealogical records. But what about those whose ancestors were indigenous or Afro-Indigenous, and whose legal or ethnic identity was erased or reclassified through forced assimilation, discriminatory laws, or census and tribal enrollment record manipulation? In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the U.S. government used the Dawes Commission to register members of the 5 civilized tribes under a new system of individual land allotments. The resulting Dawes rolls categorized people as by blood, freedmen, by marriage, etc., frequently relegating Afro-Indigenous individuals or people of mixed ancestry to freedmen, erasing their indigenous identity on paper. Those designated freedmen, descendants of formerly enslaved African persons and tribes, often lost land, heritage recognition, and legal identity over generations, even though treaties signed after the Civil War guaranteed freed enslaved people citizenship in their tribes. As a result, many descendants of enslaved Africans, Afro-Indigenous people, or reclassified Indigenous people, are effectively disenfranchised from tribal recognition, even when ancestral records exist. Current reparations frameworks almost never account for the consequences of that identity erasure or dispossession. Instead, they narrowly focus on racial categories and chattel slavery lineage. To understand why a new collective identity might be necessary, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The term African American, while powerful culturally and socially, cannot legally support reparations on its own, because African American is a broad cultural identity, not a lineage-specific classification tied to a single historical injury. It includes descendants of U.S. chattel slavery, Afro-Indigenous people whose tribal identity was erased or reclassified, participants in historic and modern migrations from the Caribbean, Africa, Latin America, or elsewhere, people whose family history includes mixed ancestry, informal reclassification, or loss of records. Legally, you cannot group all those together under a single reparations claim. Moreover, the label African American did not exist during the eras when slavery, Reconstruction, migration, or tribal dispossession occurred. Thus, African American lacks the genealogical and historical specificity required for a reparations-eligible class. Reparations law demands precision. It demands continuity. It demands evidence. But African American, as commonly used today, is legally too broad, too modern, and too disconnected from the historical record to serve as a foundation for claims. It cannot separate descendants of U.S. slavery. It cannot separate Afro-Indigenous descendants with erased or reclassified heritage. It cannot separate immigrants with no U.S. slavery lineage. It cannot separate mixed ancestry people whose records are incomplete or lost. Therefore, any meaningful reparations framework will require a new identity anchored in ancestry, history, and evidence, not simply a modern cultural label. Imagine a collective identity that recognizes descendants of enslaved Africans on U.S. soil. It recognizes Afro-Indigenous descendants whose indigenous identity was erased or reclassified. It recognizes descendants of displaced indigenous communities reclassified under racial categories. It recognizes people whose forebears suffered both racial slavery and indigenous dispossession or forced assimilation. Such an identity would reject narrow, state-imposed racial categories. It would acknowledge layered ancestral trauma and overlapping injustices. It would provide a structural basis for reparations encompassing both racial and colonial harm. It would allow claims rooted in overlapping histories of oppression, erasure, and loss. For reparations to work, the harmed group must be clearly defined, historically continuous, genealogically verifiable, and directly tied to documented harm. Section 4. What such a name might be, and why language matters. The specific label may matter less than the concept. What's essential is recognition of layered ancestry and shared injustice. Possible frameworks might include Amir Indigenous descendants, Afro-Native heritage, freed lineage Americans, and American descendants of dispossession and slavery, ADDS. The aim is a legally and socially recognized identity that can support reparations claims, compensation, land, legal recognition, identity restoration, and cultural restoration. Section 5. Realities, obstacles, and what this requires. U.S. legal and political systems are built on rigid racial and genealogical categories. Many descendants lack documentation due to forced assimilation, identity erasure, record loss, or reclassification. Tribal sovereignty and blood quantum rules complicate inclusion of Afro-Indigenous or freedmen descendants. Political resistance remains high. Broader eligibility complicates consensus. Despite obstacles, history shows reparations are possible when injustice is acknowledged. The Civil Liberties Act redress is a precedent. Flashpoints and political will can make it happen. Section 6. What examples and movements show the path? The internment redress proves the U.S. can acknowledge large-scale injustices decades later and issue compensation under law. Dawes Rolls archives provide imperfect but useful genealogical documentation for Native and freedmen descendants. Ongoing legal challenges around freedmen rights highlight urgency and complexity. If history teaches anything, injustice does not disappear because it is hidden. Erasure, forced assimilation, and reclassification do not rewrite lineage, they erase memory. Perhaps if we redefine what we call ourselves, if we demand recognition not just as Black or African American, but as descendants of dispossession, displacement, forced identity erasure, and layered ancestry, then justice can catch up with truth. If you believe this deserves serious study, share this message. Research your family history. Support reparations advocacy that honors complexity, not erasure. This is a call for recognition, a call for justice, a call for identity. Combined terminology. Plus plain language phrase, decoder, for educational purposes only, use in scripts, overlays, outreach materials. Format, term, short formal definition. Plain language phrase, a one-line, audience-friendly way to say it. Reparations, compensation, redress, or restitution for historical injustice, financial, land, legal, or symbolic. Plain language, paying victims back for past wrongs, money, land, or official apologies. Collective identity, a shared label for people with common ancestral or historical experience. Plain language, a name a group uses to stand together for justice. Afro-Indigenous, communities with both African and Indigenous ancestry, often facing dual erasure. Plain language, people with both Black and Native roots. Freedmen descendants, descendants of formerly enslaved African people affiliated with tribes and appearing on federal rolls. Plain language, families whose ancestors were black people attached to native tribes after slavery. Lineage-based reparations. Eligibility determined by descent from a specific historically harmed group. Plain language, reparations for people whose family line directly suffered a specific harm. Identity erasure, removal or alteration of cultural or legal identity through records or law. Plain language, when officials wiped people off the record or changed who they were on paper. Dawes rolls, federal enrollment lists used for land allotments, including categories like by blood and freedmen. Plain language, government lists deciding who was counted as native and who was not. Blood quantum, by blood requirement, a fractional measure of indigenous ancestry used by some tribes for membership. Plain language, a rule saying you need a certain amount of native blood to belong. Administrative reclassification, authorities changing recorded racial or ethnic identity on official documents. Plain language, officials changing someone's race on paper. Dispossession, loss of land, property, heritage, or rights due to removal, discrimination, or policy. Plain language, being forced off land or losing family land and rights. Layered ancestry, descent from multiple ancestral lines. Plain language, family history that's mixed, more than one background. Legal precedent for reparations, laws or rulings acknowledging harms and providing redress, such as the Civil Liberties Act. Plain language, proof the government can admit mistakes and pay for them. Ethno-legal recognition, official acknowledgement of a group's identity affecting rights or citizenship. Plain language, the law saying we recognize you as this group. Speculative proposal, WAS hypothesis, a model or framework offered for debate and testing. Plain language, an idea to try out, not a final plan. Civic indigenous identity, proposed. A conceptual identity uniting descendants of enslaved Africans and erased indigenous populations for reparative recognition. Plain language, a new name so people made landless and enslaved can be recognized for repair. Lineage verification, evidence establishing descent. Archives, rolls, schedules, allotment documents, oral history. DNA as corroborative only. Plain language, proof with papers and stories that your family was harmed. Racial categories change over time. Genealogical categories link people to specific historical groups. Plain language, race is how society labeled people. Genealogy links you to actual ancestors. Tribal sovereignty, relevance. Indigenous nations govern themselves, including membership rules. Plain language, tribes decide who belongs and what members receive. Reparative remedies, types, include direct payments, land restoration, legal recognition, apologies, cultural investments, and reforms. Plain language, money, land, rights, programs, and apologies. Verification, burden, policy challenge. Proving descent when records are missing or altered requires mixed evidence. Plain language, hard to prove harm when records were lost or changed. Freedmen treaties and treaty guarantees, post-Civil War agreements promising rights or citizenship to formerly enslaved people and tribes, often not honored. Plain language, promises made after slavery that were often broken. Redlining, Lashtoch, structural dispossession, policies excluding Black and Indigenous communities from housing and wealth. Plain language, maps and rules that blocked neighborhoods from buying homes and building wealth. Census classification shifts changed how race and ethnicity were recorded, affecting lineage tracking. Plain language, the government kept changing race boxes, which messed up records. Oral history as evidence, testimony and family stories used with documents to establish lineage. Plain language, family stories count too, not just old papers. Intersectional harm, overlapping systems of oppression producing compounded harms. Plain language, when more than one kind of harm hits the same people at once.